Hello and welcome. I am Exolite and this is my channel. Today we're going to be discussing the disappearance of Dougie, Legg. He disappeared on July 10th in 1971. This is a case I've seen done before, but I have never discussed it, so it will be a first for me. If you find these types of topics of interest, please subscribe. Click that bell. You'll be notified when my content goes live. And if you would please give this video a thumbs up, it helps people to be recommended my content, and I would appreciate it greatly. So let's get started and talk about Dougie. On July 10th, 1971, Douglas Legg was 8 years old, and he was going on a hike with his uncle on the Santanini estate near Newcomb in the Adirondack Mountains, and he was never seen again. What is the Santanini Preserve? Well, it was previously called the Santanini Estate, and it was established by Robert C. Pruin, a prominent Albany banker and businessman. The so-called Great Camps were popular amongst the wealthy in New York as summer retreats. With the beautiful mountains, the cooler temperatures, and the fresh air, think about Dirty Dancing. That is what we're talking about. The family camping grounds, so to speak, with their cabins, their dance lessons, etc. Robert C. Pruin acquired 12,900 acres in the town of Newcomb, just south of the Adirondack Peaks. Pruin employed the renowned architect Robert H. Robertson to design a summer residential complex. It had 40 buildings, a 24-room main lodge, and a model farm. Robert C. Pruin's heirs sold the property in 1953 to the Melvin family, Myron Melvin Sr., Myron Melvin, and Myron's brother, Crandall. They were from Syracuse. For 20 years, the Melvins and their extended family used it for their summer vacations. Can you imagine? You have 40 buildings, 24-room main lodge, and you use it for your family vacations? Douglas's mother, Dougie, the child we're talking about, was May Melvin Legg, and she was the daughter of Myron Melvin, who owned the estate. Along with his brother, they established the prestigious Syracuse law firm of Melvin and Melvin. Santanini is located in the remote Essex County, New York area, and it is surrounded by forests and lakes and wilderness. There are many wetlands in the area, and that includes swamps and marshes and bogs. And Dougie Legg was the grandchild of the owners of the estate, the Melvin family, and their extended families had gathered together for one last vacation at what they called their backcountry retreat before it was due to be sold to another establishment. Dougie Legg was 4 feet 6 inches tall, and he weighed 76 pounds. He is described as having been a keen hiker, and his family called him the mini woodsman, despite his very young age. On Saturday afternoon, July 10th, 1971, Dougie and his uncle set out on a hike around the Santanini property. His uncle noted that there was poison ivy on the trails, and he told a reluctant Dougie to return to the lodge and change from his shorts to long pants. The walk would have been about a half a mile. On his way back, Dougie passed his older brother and a cousin, about 50 to 60 yards from the main lodge building. It was very close. He failed to return to his uncle, and he was never seen again. That evening, the temperatures began to drop as the family called the state police and locals from the town, and they searched for Dougie throughout the night in the local area, including Newcomb Lake. The next day, a formal search was started by forest rangers using dogs. Helicopters were deployed, and the U.S. Air Force Base in Plattsburgh sent planes equipped with infrared FLIR. At the height of the search, there were 1,000 volunteers scouring this area. The wilderness terrain with swamps and bogs and dense forests and fallen trees made it difficult to search and dangerous. It was also hampered by the lack of coordination, with no one officially in charge. During the search and rescue efforts, the weather began to deteriorate even further, with heavy rain and falling temperatures to around 40 degrees, which added to the dangers for Dougie as well as the searchers. Keep in mind, I just told you that it was 40 degrees outside in the middle of July. That is some weather deterioration. This is a place where people went for their summer vacations. Think about that. A bloodhound found a scent, but it was lost at the edge of a swampy pond. The pond was then drained and dragged. There was nothing found. Then there were some sneaker prints, and they were found 2 miles away at Ward Pond on the 5th day of the search, but the rain had washed away any chance of dogs picking up a scent. A week after Dougie disappeared, the family hired an elite search team of over 20 mountain men from the California Sierra Madre Mountains. This family had money. They had the ability to pour their money into searching. And they had 1,000 volunteers besides that. And they still couldn't find Dougie. An elite team of mountaineers couldn't find this child on his own family's property. After 6 weeks, the state police called off a search. No trace. Nothing. Sneaker prints, which there could have been any child's. They had a large amount of family there. It didn't necessarily mean that they were Dougie's shoe prints there. And they were 2 miles away from where Dougie was even last seen. In 1993, a woman claimed that Dougie had been kidnapped and killed by her relative, and that his body was dumped into a lake in Lewis County. Officials went and searched the dry lake bed. They only learned after that the woman was a psychiatric patient and she suffered from false memory syndrome. Then, around the same time, a man came forward to report to officials that he had come across a small human skull and a partial skeleton in 1973, which he believed was human. He and a friend were hunting and became separated, and as he chased his deer across a peninsula leading to a 21-acre island in Newcomb Lake, approximately a half mile from the lodge, he found this skeleton. And he didn't report it because 2 reasons. He said he hadn't heard of the missing child, which doesn't seem like a legitimate reason, considering if you come across what you believe to be a child skeleton, I would assume, normal people would call about that. But he was also AWOL from the Navy, and he didn't want to get caught. So 20 years later, he reports it when his friend heard the news reports about the renewed search for Dougie based on that woman's false story. So the man traveled from his home in Montana to show investigators the area where he found the remains, but unfortunately, they found nothing. By then, the remains would be a tobacco-colored mess, probably, and buried under 20 years worth of sediment, moss, dead leaves. And since only the general location could be given, authorities only searched the most likely area, a 50 by 50 yard area. And there was nothing. Of course, it was 20 years later. There's a theory that Dougie was possibly attempting to follow his uncle around Newcomb Lake. Police had the theory that attempting to follow his uncle, he walked across the peninsula and, thinking he was still following the lake shoreline, became disoriented and lost on the island. The island was searched at the time of the disappearance, but it was hampered because of the dense vegetation in the area. And I don't know what leads the authorities to believe that adults can't make their way through the dense vegetation, but a child who was supposed to be on a clear path somehow ended up entangled in this dense vegetation that the adults couldn't get in and even find him. Nor could he answer when 1,000 people were searching and calling for his name. Then there's another theory that if Dougie had not become lost, maybe he fell into foul play or run off on his own accord and then drowned in a bog or swamp. This is a child they referred to as the mini woodsman. I don't understand the concept of saying that, well, perhaps he found some foul play and that's that. Or maybe he went and drowned in a bog or a swamp. This child, even though he was 8 years old, had grown up on this property. This was his family's property for vacations and retreats and probably holiday get-togethers. This is not an unknown property, and there are trails, clearly marked trails, that not only this family had used, but the family before that had used, and hundreds and hundreds of campers had used. I feel like if he could find his way back to the lodge, then he could find his way back on the trail and catch up with his uncle. I just don't feel like that is too much to expect. And he was clearly entrusted to do so. And I know a lot of people think, well, that's too much for an 8-year-old, and how could you send an 8-year-old back alone, a half mile back, which is about 5 blocks, by the way. But I've said on here many, many times to people who do not understand that the last couple of generations are really the only generations who have been so guarded and held so tightly and not allowed to be basically feral. My parents grew up feral. Their parents grew up feral. They worked on a farm. I grew up feral. By 8 years old, I would ride miles and miles and miles away from my house easily. And it was never questioned. There was never an issue with it. These were I lived out in the country in the woods. These were well-worn roads. I was able to go ride on them. I was able to go ride bikes a couple miles away from my house when I was much younger than 8 even. It was just normal. Our parents would see us at lunch, maybe. We'd have to be back by dinner. And then we'd go out again. And we'd have to be back by the time, and everybody knows this, the street lights came on. And even out where I lived, it wasn't necessarily street lights, but porch lights would come on. And, it doesn't take a genius to figure out it's getting dark. So we knew when to go, when we were supposed to be going home. And that was that. We'd go to bed, get up, do it again the next day. So it's not, we think now, with our children, our 8-year-olds now, most of them are not the same as 8-year-olds in the time we're talking right now, in this story. And around that and before that, 8-year-olds were given responsibilities. So it's unusual. It is unusual for modern day parents to have the concept that they wouldn't walk the child back, or at the very, very least, and I don't know if the uncle continued on or if he waited. I've never heard that part of the story. At the very least, you wait 5 blocks down and he's still in your line of vision. I don't know. I just want you to know that that's why it's not something that, what they did was not unusual. It wouldn't have been thought of twice. In the aftermath of Dougie's disappearance, the family did not want to return to the scene of the tragedy, which I could not imagine not returning. But in their case, they quickly contracted with the newly formed Adirondack Conservancy Committee of the Nature Conservancy so that they could purchase the entire Santanini Preserve. All the furnishings were removed, and the Conservancy then resold the property to the state of New York for incorporation into the State Forest Preserve. For 20 years, Camp Santanini buildings were inadequately maintained by the state, since the intent, as required by Article 14 of the New York State Constitution, providing for the retention of Adirondack wilderness, was to remove improvements in order to return the Santanini Preserve to a forever wild condition. Today, Santanini Preserve has been restored to its former glory and is designated a National Historic Landmark, requiring a 5-mile hike to gain access to the buildings from the closest road. The main lodge and most of the outbuildings were renovated by the Adirondack Architectural Heritage under the administration of the NYDEC and its preservation officers. And Dougie has never been found. And he vanished without a trace. Thank you for coming. Good night.